As we were discussing, due to the low approval felt by most Americans regarding the influx of Indochinese refugees, especially with the second wave, this low approval is going to influence policymakers to make refugees economically independent as fast as possible. And also, it's going to compel them to make the refugee presence as minimal as possible. That is to make them, quote unquote, as invisible as possible. So the solution was to encourage assimilation as quick as possible, to encourage the refugees to assimilate economically, culturally, language-wise, linguistically, as fast as possible. Yet, how is this assimilation, rapid assimilation, going to occur? Well, one approach that was undertaken was through the Federal Resettlement Program. Now, the Federal Resettlement Program was another government agency that was created to help the settlement of the second wave. So the Federal Resettlement Program, alongside the VOLAGs, the voluntary agencies, they chose to disperse the Vietnamese and other Indochinese refugees throughout the United States. That is to say, not to concentrate them in any particular geographic location. For example, let's think about earlier, let's say refugees or even immigrants. Usually they arrive to the United States and they settle in their particular ethnic neighborhoods. Usually these ethnic neighborhoods were found in the large city. For example, just to cite another refugee group, the Jews that were escaping the Nazi regime. Well, once they arrived in the United States, they had pre-existing, ethnic network systems that provided the Jews with support and with help to adjust to life in America. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there's virtually no Vietnamese or Cambodians or Laotians in the United States before the Vietnam War, before 1975. So that does not exist for these refugees. Okay, so again, to make them as, quote, invisible as possible and to make them assimilate as rapidly as possible, it was felt that, as mentioned in the slide, the wide dispersal of the refugees should be the approach in terms of settlement in the United States. Okay, so they were dispersed throughout the country, and recognizing this negative approval and public criticism, right? Every state in the United States received at least 100 refugees. Now, you can imagine what's going to happen from the refugee perspective. There is no natural kinship network here. There is no support system, no mutual aid system that could help them assimilate to the United States. Now, you may ask, what does wide dispersal have to do with rapid assimilation? Well, this is the logic from, the policymakers' point of view at that time. If you don't see this concentration of, let's say, Indochinese refugees in the large city, if they were instead distributed or dispersed throughout the United States in their settlement, well, that means they are forced to assimilate to American culture, right? Because you don't have that that strong ethnic tie that remains and transported across the ocean, right? And then forged in the American city. So just to repeat, through wide dispersal, it was felt that not only would these refugees be less visible among the American public because you don't see this ethnic community being developed, let's say in the large city, but also it was hoped that dispersal would facilitate assimilation of the refugees into U.S. society because of that lack of that ethnic community. Okay, so despite arguments that refugees should form their own ethnic communities, they were instead dispersed throughout the country. And again, it's in recognition of the negative approval. Now, later by the 1980s, funding for the basic needs and, occupational training and English language school and education and so forth, this dried up. The funding dried up by the early 1980s, and the government agencies basically felt overburdened with this unexpected population. Not to mention the government agencies, well, they were not well planned because they arose suddenly, right, with the fall of Saigon. So, wide dispersal, that strategy neglected the role of cultural and psychological factors due to importance placed on, public opinion and economic concern. For example, to begin, it's difficult to attain economic self-sufficiency in many of these places where the refugees found settlement. Many of them, for example, were settled in a small town in, let's say, the Midwest or the South. And in these small towns, well, there weren't many places of employment that could match the background of these refugees. And many of them were therefore forced into unskilled positions where, you didn't need to be well versed in English, for example, or very little training in that job. Secondly, there's no kinship networks for these refugees, co-ethnic networks that aid in, trauma that they experience and that they suffered from as they attempted to settle in the United States. You can only imagine the refugee's perspective arriving in a foreign country, trying to assimilate and settle, trying to find employment. At the same time, you're still dealing with the trauma that you're suffering due to the war. So, after initial settlement, characterized by wide dispersal, as we called it, well, eventually, these various refugees, Vietnamese, Cambodians, Hmong, would decide to make connections with their co-ethnics in other parts of the United States. Okay, and in other words, what we're talking about here is a new phase in their settlement patterns, from being widely dispersed to actually forming ethnic neighborhoods. Okay, so this is going to involve two types of migration. One, chain migration, which we introduced earlier in this course. Chain migration occurs when you petition relatives, right? And they could do this, that's to say the refugees, because eventually they'll no longer be refugees, but they'll be actual immigrants, all right? And also secondary migration is going to happen in tandem with chain migration. So secondary migration is very simple. It involves the process of moving from original settlement to a new community. Okay, so as we know with the refugees, their original settlement, for example, that small town in, let's say, Idaho or Texas, well, their new community that they'll migrate to through secondary migration will be, for example, Orange County in California, right? The Vietnamese community there. Okay, so these two migration processes put together will actually lead to the formation of ethnic neighborhoods, Vietnamese neighborhoods, Hmong neighborhoods, Cambodian neighborhoods. Okay, so the factors behind these migration, especially with secondary migration, in other words, what compelled them to embark upon this new migration, this new phase in their life in America? Well, it's obvious that they had minimal connection to their original place of settlement. Okay, in fact, many of them felt socially and economically isolated in these smaller towns, for example. And secondly, there were more socioeconomic opportunities available in the urban areas. Third, well, the background of trauma again. There was a need for this kinship and co-ethnic support systems. Okay, this is deemed crucial by the Vietnamese, by the Cambodians for emotional and psychological support. And fourth, related is mutual aid among refugees, right? Co-ethnics helping each other to not only survive, but hopefully to thrive, okay? And you put that together with family formation through chain migration, right? And it leads to the formation of places like in, again, Orange County, Westminster, Orange County, that's known as Little Saigon. You may ask, how did that develop? Sure, there were some initial refugees that settled there, but you see eventually, by the 80s, let's say, chain and secondary migration being involved in Little Saigon, growing from this small community to a significant one today. Also, you see other Vietnamese communities in Houston and Dallas. Another example is the Hmong community in Minneapolis, for example. That's where they settled initially, like the Lutheran Volags and so forth received them there. But eventually, many of them will decide to go to Fresno, California, due to the weather and due to co-ethnic support and so forth. So if you go to Fresno today, large population of Hmong Asian Americans. Certainly in Long Beach today, there's Cambodia Town. Here was a case where some of these refugees initially settled in the big city, right, Long Beach. But again, through secondary migration and chain migration, learning of opportunities in Los Angeles, and this formation of this Cambodian community that was not only there in the United States, but also beginning to thrive, beginning to grow. Well, this is going to lure Cambodians in other part of the country to decide to migrate to Long Beach in this case. Okay, so you can see how chain and secondary migration are crucial factors in this next phase of Indo-Chinese settlement in the United States.